Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Wowhead's interview with Ian Hazzikostas, also known as WatcherDev. Thank you so much for being here with me and Perk today. We have a ton of questions, so let's get right into it.
Sounds great. Pleasure to be here talking to you guys.
Awesome. We first wanted to touch on some questions about the new raid, Hellfire Citadel. Hellfire Citadel has a new staggered item level system with more loot variation than in the past. And how can players easily determine when an item is an upgrade, for example, when they have similar eye levels and different secondaries?
So I think in general, so the goal with that system was to better calibrate risk versus reward and ensure that, the way raiding has always worked in WoW, the deeper you go into a raid zone, the harder the fights get. Whether it's a wing boss or the end boss of the zone, you expect that to be more challenging to overcome, and so we wanted to finally have the rewards better suit that difficulty, and also make sure that players could keep getting a steady stream of upgrades as they went through the zone. In general, when it comes to evaluating the items, item levels should, for the most part, be your guide. I think in practice, there's going to be situations where maybe you have two items that are 5 item levels apart, and one of them has a whole lot of your favorite secondary stat, and the one 5 item levels higher has the one that's not your favorite secondary stat. Maybe in those cases, the lower item level one will win. But the reality is, even in those cases, we're talking about a pretty small gap and a pretty small difference where you're not really going to be hurting yourself that much, regardless of which way you go. It's probably close to a tie. In general, though, our goal is for item level to be the main determining factor in how strong an item is, and the presence of an ever-increasing primary stat on the item tends to make that the case.
Awesome. So now I've heard a lot of players have feedback about Hellfire Citadel that maybe the gap between heroic and normal difficulty is a little big, like normal might be a little too easy and heroic might be a little bit too hard. Is this anything that you guys have seen in player feedback, and how do you feel about that?
There's certainly a fairly large gap there, very much so at the start of the zone, because to some extent the two are catering to very different audiences potentially, and groups that have different means available to them to overcome the challenge that they're facing. For normal mode, if you can't defeat the first couple of bosses on normal mode Hellfire Citadel, you basically can't raid in 6.2. And the audience for who we want to be able to come in and have some success there includes guilds that only did a little bit of normal Foundry. There are plenty of guilds that maybe had 4 or 5 bosses down. They could get, Gruul, Orgorger, Darmak, Hans and Franz, maybe one other down, and that's about it, and that's where their progress in Foundry stopped. They should be able to come in and have some success in Hellfire and get some upgrades and go from there. Now for Heroic, I think the expectation is that, coming into Heroic, we generally tune difficulties for having mostly gear from the prior difficulty. And in the case of Heroic Hellfire Citadel, that implies a fair amount of normal Hellfire Citadel gear, which ranges in item level from 690 to 705. So I think we've definitely seen some feedback from groups that had done Heroic Foundry and were coming in with an eye level around 685, 690, and expecting to have a pretty easy time picking up where they left off.
Not so much.
Fighting boss 1 of Heroic. And, the reality is if you're coming in with an item level of 690, it's certainly possible, and plenty of groups have defeated Hellfire Assault at that level, but groups should recognize that they're actually doing it a little bit under-geared, because the entire second floor of Hellfire Citadel on normal is dropping, 695, 700, 705 from Archimon, and that a group progressing through sort of linearly would have much more of that gear coming in. So I think groups are realizing that. We've seen a lot of groups after a kind of harsh initial experience the first day, go to normal, get some experience with the fights there, get some gear, and come back and have more success. That said, we did make an adjustment to Hellfire Assault in particular on Heroic, reducing the health of some of the mobs, because the DPS check was probably a bit tighter than we wanted, even if you had the gear level for what boss 1 should be.
So there was a tweet made yesterday that Hellfire Citadel trash is personal loot only, and that's caused a lot of controversy and discussion that this impacts gold revenue and gearing alts and absentees for guilds. And we were curious if you could talk a little bit more about the change, and we've had some players ask, why couldn't they just auto-set this only for groups formed through Group Finder and leave guild groups free to master loot?
There's definitely a version of the system. I think it's not something we have the ability to do right now, but it's definitely an interesting suggestion that we could explore to have it be tied to guild group status. Though even then, I could also see some situations where you want to bring a couple of people along, or you have a formal raiding group that consists of people from 2 or more guilds that still wouldn't be able to qualify and could have some of the same concerns. In reality, though, it's important to remember that, if you are part of a social group that raids regularly, you're a guild or whatever, and you have an existing policy for how you handle and distribute BOE items, this change really shouldn't impact that. I understand there's maybe a small bit of inconvenience where the master looter that previously would have had everything in their bags right away now has to say, hey, could you pass that to me? But we're not binding these items to people that, even though personal loot normally isn't tradable, the fact that they're BOEs means that they are tradable. And so if you want to sell them to raise revenue for repairs, for consumables, for whatever else, that's still an option that's on the table. But it also gives a bit more player agency in many other groups out there where people have been kind of at the whim and the mercy of at the mercy of the whims of their pug leader. Where now you can't reserve those BOEs for yourself, and people have, the right to have a fair shot at the items, and they can be distributed from there afterwards.
So as a dev, as a designer, what is your favorite Hellfire Citadel encounter and why?
That's tough. There's a lot. There are several favorites, honestly. If I had to pick one, I'll just say Gorfiend for now. That may change once I've spent more time personally fighting bosses like Velhari, Manaroth, or Archimonde. I think the visual design of Gorfiend is really awesome. I like the throwbacks it has to some of the Black Temple mechanics in terms of Shadow of Death that unavoidably kills you, and just the simple elegance of the interplay between what's going on inside Gorfiend's stomach and what the dead players have to do to stop the rest of the raid from suffering from being overwhelmed by ads, and just that back and forth there. I think it has worked out pretty well, and it's an appropriate level of challenge from what we've seen so far, so really happy with that one.
The next topic we want to talk about was professions a bit. The Q&A talked about how 6.2 moved away from the Garrison-centric profession system, and what was the reasoning for the shift towards that Garrison-centric system in the first place, and what problems did that hope to solve, and what were the benefits of it?
I think when we were designing the Garrisons in 6.0, in Warlords to begin with, we wanted to make sure that it really felt like a central part of your experience in Draenor. That the story of Draenor was the story of building a base, of raising an army, and that really it was going to feel like the center of your experience, like I said. We certainly succeeded in doing that, I think. But we've realized, looking at gameplay and how things have unfolded over the past few months, that there are definitely some consequences and harm to the rest of the gameplay experience because we arguably succeeded too much in that regard. We wanted, buildings to feel important and integrated into your professional experience, but the fact that people could be self-sufficient to an extent that wasn't the case previously, that the interdependency between gatherers and crafters was being eroded, that people felt like there was no point to being a miner or an herbalist when everyone was just gathering massive amounts of ore from their mine or from their garden anyway. Like, none of those things were really great outcomes. So we really wanted to refocus it on, obviously, keeping some of the importance of your profession buildings and the benefits of having them, but also give you a reason to get back out into the world, and also a reason to be a gatherer and a reward for being that. And certainly we're seeing, Fellblight is selling for quite a bit of gold. There's certainly demand for it. People who are herbalists, who are miners, who are getting it in Tanaan are able to make good profit doing so. And also, I think other little bits of content like the new Jewelcrafting epic gem cuts that actually, again, aren't just a pattern that you learn randomly or that you use a daily cooldown currency to purchase, but rather have to go out into the world and pursue various activities to obtain, that you can prioritize the order in which you want to get them, what's most important for you, what their sort of cost benefit is of doing a particular type of content versus how much you want it, and so forth. And I think all those are positive elements.
So are you happy with the current Garrison world balance for professions, or are there plans to move towards even more of an outdoor emphasis on professions in future patches?
I think where we stand right now is a pretty good place. I think the Garrison is important to crafting in Draenor still, but it's not the sole locus of crafting activity. And it is important if you want certainly to be the best craftsperson and you want to make all the items that are available, you need to go out into the world and do more than just Garrison activities.
Sure. Now, you talked a little bit about Jewelcrafting just a minute ago, and I kind of want to touch on that a little bit. Jewelcrafting got a big overhaul in 6.2, and it is arguably right now the most challenging, or at least the most time-consuming. And a lot of people want to know if there are any plans to kind of bring the other professions up to speed with where Jewelcrafting is.
I think to some extent there's a bit of an experiment there. So I think we're looking at how that plays out, and we don't want every profession necessarily to follow the exact same formula and to feel like they're all cut from the same cloth. Currently, the state of epic gems and where they are is in terms of what the 6.2 edition was, is that they're a pretty high-end item that's mostly in demand right now by raiders who are looking to maximize their gear and are willing to pay massive amounts of gold. And the reward for doing the activities to unlock those, plans and to make the gems are fairly high right now. I mean, an epic gem cut is going for, over 10,000 gold in many cases. So that's actually kind of exciting at the same time. And the challenge and reward are commensurate. So I think we'll see how that plays out. We'll see how the economy settles out over the weeks and months to come as more and more players get the ability to make these cuts and go from there.
Yeah, on the other end of the spectrum, we wanted to just touch on Enchanting a little bit because that didn't receive any 6.2 updates. And while it does make sense because if you get new gear, you have to put enchants on it, and other professions, meanwhile, need new recipes to keep up, Enchanting doesn't feel very fun right now, and many guilds already have material saved up from farming. So we were curious if that was intended, if there's future plans for enchanters to have something that is Fellow Blight, because even Inscription has that cool vanity glyph that takes it, or even things like fun vanity toys are just some updates to the profession.
Yeah, I think that there's no question that, Enchanting didn't get quite as much love as some of the other professions in 6.2. Some of that just has to do with the nature of item progression and how it fits in. I think as we introduce higher item level items, tailors, blacksmiths, leather workers need to be able to make higher item level items to compete with the new raid gear and the new things that are available. For Jewelcrafting, while their profession supplements and complements the existing gear, the unique nature of how sockets work in connection to Warforged as a bonus has meant that as item level has gone higher and higher, Warforged got better, whereas the value of a socket stayed the same. So whereas initially we wanted sockets to be roughly equivalent to power as Warforged, as item level got higher, they were falling farther and farther behind, which made us want to introduce new epic gem cuts to kind of keep that balance in place at the highest item levels, which in turn led us to make some new content and systems to support those epic gem cuts. Enchanting didn't have any of those external pressures, and so I think there's definitely more we could do with it in the future, but that kind of explains why it didn't happen in 6.2. There wasn't really the need to make it happen in that particular patch.
Awesome,
right.
thanks.
Now we want to talk a little bit more about garrisons, and we were wondering, how do you envision the role of garrisons in 6.2, and how does it differ from 6.1, 6.0? The Q&A emphasized a lot of changes to make players less dependent on their garrison, and we've seen additional changes like the salvage nerf and stuff like that. So we're just wondering what your thoughts on all that were.
I mean, it's still the place where most players are going to begin and end their play sessions. It's still very central to what you're doing. There are still many, many rewards in a wide variety of forms, whether it's gold, oil, Hexus crystals, other items that you're getting from doing your garrison follower missions, from keeping up with your work orders and so forth. We feel like ultimately, though, we didn't need to expand the dependence or reliance upon the garrison in the later patch content. There was already enough there. So we turned our attention to other areas, such as the outdoor world in Tanaan, instanced content, the new content in the shipyard, to kind of flesh out and counterbalance the existing weight and presence of the garrison.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that ties into a follow-up question we had about how are you different tactics to get players out in the world more in patch 6.2 versus just staying in their garrison.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the rewards on the content require you to get out and engage with it, whether it's crafting, whether it's the new catch-up gear that you can get just from getting the items are scattered around to non-jungle that are now better than the things your followers could just get for you by default running missions, which were limited to the 630 to 645 range. And I think we're finding that is the case so far, just looking at what players have been doing. The goal isn't to kill the garrison, it's just to provide reasons to get back out into the world, as we saw that the rewards that garrisons were offering, particularly towards the tail end of the 6.0, 6.1 cycle, often were so compelling that there didn't seem like much reason to do anything else. And I think we just updated the content, updated the rewards accordingly, and we're happy with the balance right now.
Cool. We had a question specifically about gold missions, as was seen in the patch notes for the first time. So a lot of people are curious how gold missions work after the 6.2 changes, if they randomly proc on all Garrison characters, or do individual missions just have a chance per character to be lower, and other people are concerned if characters on other servers have any effects on the chance you get gold missions.
So I think there are a lot of inner workings under the hood to the system, and I don't think we don't want to get into all of them because it just invites players to try to game the system in ways that may be misleading and may not be super fun. But at the end of the day, the goal here was to continue to allow alts and multiple characters on an account to generate more and more gold compared to just having one character or two characters. Every additional character is not penalizing you. It's definitely increasing the amount of gold that you're getting overall. You don't need to worry about, oh, I logged on the wrong character and got this mission there, therefore I'm not going to get it on the one with all the treasure hunters. The system just doesn't work that way. You don't have to worry about the order in which you're doing stuff on your characters. Ultimately, it's just that gold missions will appear less frequently for the remainder of a given week once they've been done on your account. And so that's something that will just naturally have a diminishing returns. Having more characters means you definitely can do more missions, you can get access to more missions, but we wanted to reduce both the pressure to run as many garrisons and to maintain them as actively as players felt compelled to in some cases, but also, frankly, just to reduce the amount of gold that garrisons are bringing into the world. And it's just about straight economic inflation. I've seen concerns, and I could call them conspiracy theories, so sure, I'll call them conspiracy theories about, no, this is just to fuel token sales. And ultimately, it's just about inflation. If the amount of gold in the world doubles, the price of a token will double, but what that gold buys you will go down by 50%. And if you want to buy a crafted item off the auction house, or you want to buy flasks or augments or whatever, you're going to have to pay twice as much. It's not about making the token more or less valuable. The token is actually a reflection of the economic purchasing power of gold. And in fact, curbing inflation, I think, is in the interests of all players who have established existing gold, because all that's going to do is make the gold that you've worked for in the past increasingly less valuable and turn rich players into no longer rich players. We want the sources of gold in the game to be varied and balanced, and we were seeing over time more and more and more gold was coming from the garrison system, and it really threatened to destabilize the economy as a whole in a pretty harmful way. And so we took the approach that we did because we didn't necessarily want to punish the player who's just running a garrison period, but also at the same time reduce the amount of gold coming in from the system while alleviating some of the pressure from people that we were hearing who felt like they were just burning themselves out doing 7, 8, 12 garrisons and trying to maintain them because they felt like it was just so lucrative that they couldn't afford not to, that they were being silly if they didn't do that. And that really is just not a great place for the system as a whole to be, where you can't be competitive in the economic marketplace, where traditional activities like trade skills and gathering, or going and running old instances and selling transmog items, or whatever you might have been doing to get money, were just being crushed by run multiple garrisons. And that's the right answer, and it's the only right way to make money, and if you're not doing that, you're doing it wrong. So that's the reality at the end of the day. It is a nerf to gold income from garrisons. We don't expect people to be thrilled that, okay, I'm getting less gold than I was before, but hopefully if people can view it in the broader perspective of the economy as a whole, part of what it's doing is protecting the value of the gold that you already have, and there is benefit in that to everybody.
Now, kind of on the same page, the Salvage Yard also got a nerf. You get significantly less boxes, like way less boxes, and you also get less items that you can sell for gold. And I don't think the Salvage Yard was all about making gold. I mean, there were a lot of chances to get like rare transmog items and stuff like that. So do you feel like it's at a good place right now, or are there still plans to alter the Salvage Yard?
I think we're definitely going to look at, looking at statistics for how it plays out based on actual player behavior now that we're on the live servers and seeing the system. I think there were two motivations behind the desire on our end. First was to actually reduce some of just the sheer hassle of dealing with the Salvage Yard. The number of people that I've seen and heard from, and coworkers included, people in the community, etc., who were just walking around with like 200 unopened salvage boxes because they just didn't want to deal with the sheer hassle of going through all of them. But they were still running missions on a regular basis because, of course, the missions are so lucrative. Like, that was just an awkward place to be. And so that was kind of some of the thought behind getting rid of all the varied gray items and condensing that source of gold into one consistent item that can stack so that you can feel like you can open up multiple boxes without needing dozens of open inventory slots before you have to vendor everything. But then at the same time, I think as I want to say Bashiok said recently on the forums in response to a thread on this issue, part of the intent was to nerf the salvage yard a bit. If you don't have a salvage yard, or certainly if you didn't have a salvage yard, you were completely doing it wrong. If you talk to a friend about garrisons and they described their buildings and what they had in their small plots, and they said, oh yeah, I have 2 professional buildings and a storehouse, the immediate response would be, wait, you don't have a salvage yard? Like, do you realize what you're giving up? And ultimately, it's something that was just too rewarding. And so, again, nerfs are not designed, they're probably not going to be embraced with open arms. Our goal isn't to destroy fun, it's to preserve some interesting choices and preserve the state of the economy as a whole, which I think does, again, benefit everybody on some level.
We had a few questions on the shipyard. I know that Corey on the instance covered a lot, but we had a few specific questions. So is it intended that the mission completion orders from the Mage Tower instantly complete shipyard missions? Because it seems that shipyard missions were designed to take longer than the follower missions and to prevent players from frequently starting new missions, especially when the mission completion order can finish a 2-day legendary mission or a 3-day treasure one. So that seemed a bit inconsistent.
Yeah. It definitely, I mean, it certainly makes those rush orders from the Mage Tower or Spirit Lodge more powerful. It is how the system works, so that's not something that we have plans to change. But I think ultimately if players are consistently using those rush orders, right now they may be burning through their stockpile of garrison resources, constantly refitting their ships with new equipment to tackle the missions. But at some point I think players will find that resources and oil are going to be a constraint if they're accelerating the system that way. It does give an extra bit of value to a building that at times was seen as not being very useful. And so that is actually kind of cool on our end to see.
Yeah, for sure. Now, another thing that I've seen people talk about regarding shipyards is that the useful NPCs for the shipyard are all over the place. Like, your mission table is here, and then the guy who builds the ships is like way over there, and then you've got the guy who sells upgrades way the heck over there, and it's just sort of inconvenient. Was there a reason for this? Because it's hard as a player to see why it would be kind of not so user-friendly.
The exact placement and layout of things, I think it was just spreading them out across the space that was available. Naturally, your dry dock is a bit off from the place where ships naturally seem like they would dock, so it felt like that would be the place where you'd go to build ships, versus sort of you're high up looking down on the shipyard as a whole when you're sending out your guys on missions. There's certainly some element of inconvenience there. I think we would hope that it's not that big a deal in the context of how often you're likely actually doing missions. I think if you were doing as many naval missions as you were follower missions, and you were constantly having to do this loop dozens of times a day, that would be tremendously inconvenient. I think once you have your shipyard up and running and you've built most of your ships and you have a full complement of ships, what you're probably doing is checking in at your mission table up top, sending them out on missions. Occasionally you might decide that you need to refit 1 or 2 of them. You go buy the equipment, come back, and that's it, because for the next 4 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, as the case may be, it's not that large a distance. It's certainly something we'll keep an eye on if it ends up, if we hear feedback and it ends up feeling like, as we're playing through it ourselves, this is increasingly irritating and increasingly annoying. We can look into, adding some convenience there.
Yeah, I am pretty happy that the Alliance got a wall bulldozed so they could go directly to the shipyard. That was pretty convenient.
Yep.
So finally, one more shipyard convenience question.
Sure.
Some players have been asking if there's any plans to make either the garrison or the shipyard or both more alt-friendly in the future. I know in the past people have talked about the gold cost of garrisons, and now other players are raising concerns that aspects of the shipyard are attached to various rep grinds, which might be tedious to repeat.
Yes, I think certainly I could see an argument for, on the blueprint front, allowing alts to access those more readily. On the garrison side, we very much resisted making elements of the garrison account-wide, just because what you build in your garrison and the choices you make and the followers you prioritize were seen as integral to your experience leveling up through Draenor and playing a given character. One character may have certain professions and focus on certain buildings and certain desires. You might have a barn on your leatherworker and not care about it on your tailor. You might want a gladiator sanctum on your PvP character but not care about it on the character that you mostly use to raid or gather. And so in general, and because followers were tied into those choices and so forth, it felt like something that really should be parallel, separate systems. We have added some measures of convenience, whereas in 6.2, for follower upgrades, if you've on at least one character raised 10 or more followers to item level 650 plus, you can purchase follower upgrades directly from a vendor on your other characters, which should be helpful there. I think, again, we'll see how the shipyard blueprint system plays out in particular. The goal is to let people who want to participate in the minigame on multiple accounts, multiple characters, do so, and not necessarily feel like just because they've done it on one, there is no gameplay remaining on the other characters. But again, if it feels like there's too much inconvenience, that's always something we're going to keep an eye on.
Sure. Now, we're not sure if this is your area of expertise, but we do have some questions on character models, and I know that some new stuff came in 6.2, like the orc female running animation. There was some new animation for night elves, and we were curious if more character model tweaks were coming. And we also had some questions about those Pepe costumes that we saw. Where are they, and where can we get them? Asking the hard-hitting questions here.
I know, seriously. No softballs. Pepe costumes, that's something that you'll have to wait and see. I'm not at liberty to discuss Pepe. There's top secret Pepe-related information. As far as the character models, it's definitely not my area of expertise, but I know as a team, this isn't the end. It's something that we're constantly going to be reworking, refining, tweaking, adding more options where appropriate, improving the look and feel based on feedback that we get from players. We saw what we did in 6.0 not as an endpoint, but as the beginning of a new round of iterations. We wanted to bring up the character models to a certain new level of fidelity, but we knew from the outset that we were going to get lots of passionate feedback based on any changes, because we are changing, in many cases, the look and feel and identity of characters that people are so strongly attached to for 10 years and more at this point. So we know that that's an ongoing conversation, it's an ongoing cycle, and there's definitely more to come. Nothing specific to announce on my end, but I wouldn't view this as a closed book by any means.
Cool. So we had a follow-up question on the Q&A topic about transmog, how Tier 18 and PvP sets were similar. Wowhead users really love transmog, and they were curious why the Tier 18 and Wild PvP armor sets were identical recolors while there was more variation between Tier 17 and Primal PvP sets. They were similar in design, but the Mythic and the Elite Conquest shoulders had distinctive details, and people seem to some people preferred that variety with the 6.0 sets.
In all honesty, I know it's a terrible, unsatisfying answer for players. Some of it just boils down to time and production. Warlords, was originally on schedule for a certain date, and then that date gets pushed back a couple of times internally so that we can continue to flesh out certain elements in the outdoor world, add more content, polish things, fix bugs, etc. And that bought more time to greater diversify and add more depth and differences to the PvE versus PvP sets in Tier 17 in patch 6.0. In the time frame we have available to get a patch out the door, that extra bandwidth simply wasn't available. And so when it comes down to, is it something we'd like? Certainly. Is it something we're going to push the patch back and delay it entirely to make happen? I don't think that would have been the right call. So I think we're certainly aware that diversity and variety and different looks are always appreciated by players. They want both to be able to feel like the gear they're getting looks meaningfully different from the gear that other people around them have, but also have more transmog options and more cosmetic looks available in general. So it's something that we always strive for, but we have to draw lines somewhere, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, at least the Rares and Tanan have kind of cool throwback transmog models and some cool things there. So
yeah. On the same topic of transmog, we've gotten teased a couple times with the Diablo-esque transmog system, and a lot of people who collect transmog gear are completely out of space. And is that still something that's in the works? Is it coming soon?
It's something we're working on, and hopefully we'll have more details to share on soon. It's something we want to do. It's not a simple system. It's a pretty large change to how items are stored and the concept of items. in World of Warcraft. And there's also a lot of UI that has to go into the system as well. It's something we want to do right, we want to do elegantly, but it's definitely something we want to do and that we're going to do.
I'm glad it's still on the back burner.
I wouldn't even call it super back burner. I think it's something that's actively being worked on.
Nice.
Awesome. So continuing on with vanity items, we had a few questions about Tanaan Jungle, and just a major question was, there's been some comparisons to the Timeless Isle, and we were curious how Tanaan improves on the Timeless Isle, and what are some of the concepts that the team liked and reused versus some that were improved upon in different ways.
I mean, I think there's more structure, there's more story to what's going on in Tanaan. It's a much larger place than Timeless Isle. I mean, it's many times larger than Timeless Isle. Timeless Isle was a little bit like a sandbox playground of the various flora and fauna of Pandaria, and it was just kind of a place to go explore, find random things, and there wasn't much direction at all. Whereas Tanaan exists very much to advance the core story of Warlords of Draenor, and we're introducing you more information about bosses that you're going to fight in Hellfire Citadel, the various factions that are at odds, whether it's the Sabron, the Arakoa, the Bleeding Hollow, and your own forces that have attained a foothold in Tanaan Jungle. So as you explore the zone, I think there is both more direction, more storytelling elements, but we're also keeping some of that core explore and find treasures, explore and find rares, collect your currency to unlock and purchase toys or mounts or items that you can use, to upgrade your character or catch up an alt. And so I think it's very much an intersection of those types of gameplay.
Yeah, one little improvement I liked was how you purchase the Baleful item and then you see the stats and you can choose to upgrade it, while with Burden of Eternity it felt very random and you could get an upgraded item you didn't really want the stats for.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of on the same topic, Tanaan has a lot of cool vanity items, but not all of them are toys. And a lot of people are curious how you determine the difference between an on-use item and a toy. And a certain message board may have described it as a dartboard process, but we'd like to think it's more complex than that. So,
yeah, it's so in general, our philosophy here is that items that have actual utility or any kind of player power component shouldn't go in the toy box. So if it gives you a speed boost, if it lets you levitate or slow fall or fly, or if you might actually use it for mechanical advantage, that's not part of that's not what the toy box is supposed to be about. The toy box is purely for fun, cosmetics, visual transforms, creating flashy visuals, that sort of thing. There's no question that we don't apply that philosophy consistently enough. That there are things that there are things that just get missed, right? There are things that end up in the toy box that probably shouldn't be, that violate that rule. And I think there are more things, because we have many different designers on the team creating toys and just, with in their spare time, just trying to fit in cool ideas that they have, that they don't always get included in our final passes to decide what goes into the toy box. Many of those toys that could be in the toy box and aren't are things that are very likely candidates to be included in a future patch.
Are there any more improvements planned for bag space, especially because Warlords has so many interesting items from treasures, rares, and quests that don't qualify as toys? So we felt that we freed up some bag space and then we filled it all up again with a new interesting type of item.
Yeah, it's something we're always mindful of. Certainly the transmog system I mentioned earlier would free up a whole lot of bank space, which would in turn free up bag space, which would in turn, give you more room to play with. I mean, at this point, players are walking around in many cases with well over 100 inventory slots, and we don't think the answer is ever larger bags. At some point, we need to ask ourselves, if 118 inventory slots, or however many you may have, isn't enough to carry the items you feel like you need to carry on a day-to-day basis, we think there's a problem with that. We want to look more closely at why. Some of the changes we've made, include more cross-spec gear, so you don't need to carry around a separate tank set from your DPS set. You maybe just carry around a one-hander and a shield that you put on when you go from arms to prot. But that's a far cry from how it used to be. More steps in that direction. Most quest items no longer clutter your bags. They just kind of invisibly increment your progress tracker. You don't need to physically carry the bear asses or whatever that you collected from killing all the bears. But it's something, obviously we know it's an ongoing concern. We need to be mindful and respectful of players' bag space, and I think we are going to keep looking at that and seeing what we can do to minimize clutter and make sure that you can fit all the things that you want to carry into your bags.
Now I have two follow-up questions about that. I'll merge them into one. Are there any plans to allow us to switch out that default 16 slot bag? And also, has there been any thought of expanding the quest log? I find myself almost every day having to abandon one quest to pick up another.
So, okay. So with the backpack, that's no active plans to announce. I know it's something we can do. At the end of the day, it's no different really than just adding two extra slots to every other bag that you have.
Oh, do that.
It boils down to it boils down to the question of are 120 bag slots enough? Do you need more? And if you really honestly need more than that, isn't that a different problem with our game? That we shouldn't just keep band-aiding by giving you more and more and more stuff that you then lose track of and have to spend, minutes finding the thing that you lost in your own bags that are supposed to be things that you're carrying around conveniently. As for quest log, again, I think we, to some extent, those limitations are there and should be there. If we're designing the game elegantly, the question I would ask is, why do you have 25 quests in your log?
Because I pick up all the end quests. I don't do them every day.
Yep. And that is, and that's and that's the kind of thing where maybe those are just too many quests, and maybe there are different options. Right, exactly. I know. I think we have no plans to expand the number of quests you can keep in your log past 25. Because again, at some point, it's like, okay, now you have 40 quests, 50 quests. It's like hard drive space. Like the bigger hard drive you get, you'll download more stuff and fill it up. You always manage to fill up the storage space that you have. But increasingly, with something like a quest log, now you would again get to a place where you can't even keep track of the quests that you have anymore. You just keep things there from ages ago, and you have to go through and purge your quest log periodically because you have things from 2 years ago that you've forgotten about. There's some value in encouraging people to abandon quests that have been sitting there for a long time. It's like cleaning out your closets because you're out of space. Give stuff to charity, get rid of it. Now you have room. It's like if the quest's been sitting there for a couple of years or a couple of months and you haven't done it, you never thought about doing it. Again, it's like, I haven't worn this in 3 years.
Stay away from
just
my
give
closet.
This to Goodwill. Look, just
Stay
saying.
away from my closet. Fair enough.
I had a follow-up question on reputations. We both were a bit shocked at the Q&A to hear that it didn't seem like reputations fit into Draenor at first, and it made sense they were added at the last minute, but we were just a bit shocked because reputations have been in pretty much every patch, every expansion, and while we understand that there was a problem at the start of MoP with all the dailies, we were just surprised to learn that reputations were maybe not even going to be in Draenor at all, and we just were curious to hear more of the reasoning behind that.
It's pretty much that. I think that we'd structured our content in a more free-form manner. We imagine people would be going out, doing their daily battleground objectives to get Apexis crystals, triggering garrison invasions as sort of a weekly thing. I think in reality, those systems ended up being pretty under-rewarding, and that's something we just frankly dropped the ball on in terms of what you could get from those systems relative to the time invested, relative to what you could get just from running garrison missions or going out and doing almost any other content and instances. And so that was underutilized, certainly. But in that structure that we'd originally envisaged, there wasn't really much of a need for reputations or a system where they felt like they'd fit in cleanly. And so we added some towards the end, and yes, there wasn't much to prop them up. And they unfortunately just turned into, find the most efficient spot, go to Lost Vale Anzu and join a pre-made group via CRZ and just grind a bunch of mobs there and fill your Arako Outcasts rep. There isn't a lot of great gameplay to that, and we're frankly not terribly proud of that. Tanan represents a step, I think, in a better direction. I don't think it's all the way there. I don't think they're the best reps we've ever made, but there is more content, there is more structure to them.
There's some more variation, like
yes.
one you can grind out, one's more story-based, one is the treasures, so
exactly.
That's at least a good balance.
Yes, but I think we can do more. I think that, we definitely recoiled a bit too strongly from our Mist's reputations that, I think it had strong storytelling elements to them and had, progression in the sense of unlocking events as you hit certain rep thresholds. I think we sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater, looking at the reaction to rep gating and the need to do daily quests to fill those bars, to buy things like Valor gear, and probably overreacted, honestly. I think we are stepping back away from that and moving towards what I think is hopefully a better middle ground going forward.
Cool.
Now, we have a couple questions about some like buggy stuff that happened in 6.2, so forgive us.
Sure.
But I know there's a lot of controversy right now because there was an unintended change with the mailbox where if mail expires, it's perma-deleting gear. And we have a couple questions about that. Is there any ETA to that being fixed? Since it's not like player error, if something was deleted in this bug, are people gonna get their stuff back? We'd also love to hear about like the behind the scenes process of when something like this happens, just because we're curious. Like if you have a big bug like this, I mean, what happens? Like, how do you guys handle it?
That is one of our highest priorities right now. It is actively like one of the first things I did when I came in this morning was check with our producers who are working with engineering and customer service, nailing down the scope of the impact here, what the underlying causes are, and how we can fix it. Wanted to check in with them, make sure progress was being made, that we had an ETA. Don't have a specific ETA to announce, but it is like literally number one priority issue right now because we recognize there's tons at stake here for players. People's items are some of the most valuable possessions. The last thing anyone wants is items lost in limbo between two characters. Even aside from that, there's just the inconvenience of not being able to bounce something back if you were counting on doing that because you sent stuff to your enchanting alt or what have you. So the process there is ultimately, and I know it seems like a little bit of a cop-out, massively complicated game with 90 million moving parts and bits of code, and there are systems like that actually don't get tested much on PTR just because of the nature of how PTR works. Very few people have occasion to mail things from one PTR character to another. It's just not something that falls in people's common experience. And it just slipped through the cracks, honestly. It was a mistake, an oversight on our part. Unintended change, definitely not anything we would intentionally restrict, and we're working to fix it as soon as possible.
Is part of that fix going to be a restoration of people who maybe lost things, or is that not discussed yet?
I honestly, it seems like something that's likely. I can't speak on behalf of what our CS policy is going to be off the top of my head, but we very much understand that players value their possessions and that no one wants to lose anything. And usually in the past, when items have been lost or deleted through something that was our fault, restorations were done.
Cool.
We had a less urgent question, but still, it's still an annoying bug. People have been reporting different phasing issues, and we're curious if there's any fix for them. For example, Varix the Damned in Tanan, or if you use the Goblin Glider from the Horde Garrison to the Horde Shipyard.
Yes. So, well, what's the specific issue with the Garrison to Shipyard glider?
It just does weird. It does weird things. It because you go from one phased area out of a phased area into a phased area. Sometimes it'll knock you off your glider. It doesn't function the way it should.
Okay, that sounds like just a bug with the transition from what is basically your own personal instance out into the world back into your own personal instance. That's something we can look into. That's certainly a quality.
You can blame
bug.
Goblin Engineering. It's okay.
Okay, I'll go with that. As far as Tanan, I think a lot of those issues are currently awkward, and we think they will be improving in the next few days. What we did at the start of launch was run a number of parallel instances of Tanan Jungle, as I'm sure players have noticed. There are multiple shards of Tanan that players are distributed among. This is to help avoid server performance issues. When we have all players at the same time pouring in on day one to a brand new area, Timeless Isle back in Mists of Pandaria for the first week was actually a pretty miserable experience just in terms of lag and latency and 3 second, 4 second quote unquote instant cast times, let alone if you were trying to fight the world bosses there. Because it was the brand new thing, everyone flocked there at the same time. As we're seeing as we get a few days away from launch, players are more spread out around the zone, working on different objectives in different parts of the zone, and falling into more of their usual play cycles and times of day where they tend to play the game, as opposed to patch day rush. We can back off that significantly and either run far fewer parallel shards, or in many cases none, and fit everyone just in the exact same world tab, and they won't have the awkwardness of hearing a boss yell that's not up in their version of Tanan, or seeing themselves awkwardly transition when they join a group or what have you.
Cool. Now this is a question I have seen a lot. I'm sure you've heard it a lot, but what is the reasoning that players cannot queue for Mythic Dungeons?
Part of it actually, so a couple things. I think some of it is getting you back out into the world, and for the first, it's learning where these instances actually are for the first time ever. If you haven't done challenge modes, many people may have quested through the entirety of Spires of Iraq, but it never actually occurred to them that, oh right, Skyreach is there. There's some value to that. We don't think it's that tremendously inconvenient to get from point A to point B to do what is, for many groups, a 40-minute to an hour-long experience as they work their way through the dungeon. Also, and I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, there is some value to inconvenience from a design perspective in promoting a little bit of social stickiness and cohesion.
Sure.
By making it a bit more inconvenient to quickly get a replacement to the instance if you don't like someone in your group, you add a little bit of extra encouragement to work together. It's an extra reason to not necessarily kick the person who did bad DPS or who stood in the fire on your last attempt and when you wiped on the boss and get a quick replacement via the queue that's instantly going to get teleported to you. But instead say, hey, next time you should be careful about that. Hide behind the pillar when you get targeted by, the gunner's attack on the second boss of Grimrail. And we've seen, and part of that little social interaction is what dungeons are about. Having run dungeons myself, talked to a lot of friends who've been doing Mythic Dungeons the last few days, one of the great things is you actually see more cooperation and discussion and actual, interaction in party chat in these groups than we have in dungeons in a long time. And I like to think that maybe that's a little part of it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think they're really balanced too right now as far as like how much you have to put into them and what you get out of them. They're challenging but not too challenging. But as someone who raids, like my whole guild is like obsessed with them. They're really
Cool.
fun.
We actually have a hotfix that's in the works right now. I think it might have been posted while I was sitting here talking to you guys about tripling the chance for Mythic Dungeon loot to be Warforged.
Ooh.
So
Oh, nice, and that's the 705 boost, not the 6
Exactly,
levels.
yes. Warforged Mythic Dungeon loot is 705, and you will see 3 times as many Warforged items as you did
nice.
previously. That's going to take effect next week, starting with the next raid lockout. We didn't want to do it midweek because of the weekly lockouts. It might have seemed unfair to people who got their Mythic Dungeon clears out of the way on Tuesday or Wednesday versus those who did it on the
705 is like equivalent and normal loot or Khazak, so it's nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, it's really good.
So for a final question, we couldn't do an interview without having to bring up flying.
Of course.
And lots of people are just asking if there's any sort of ETA on how long it will be before that 6.2.x patch. I know in the Q&A you were talking about how you have to make sure everything works in Draenor before flying is introduced, but people are just curious if it's going to be really soon. They'll hit, they'll grind out their reps and then all of a sudden be able to fly soon, or if we're looking at more of months versus a week's time frame.
I would say weeks more than months. Some people, there's no question there'll be people who have the Pathfinder achievement completed before flying is available. Certainly if you've been using those items that give you 1,000 to all rep and paying an immense amount of gold for them on the auction house. But honestly, I think in the near future, there'll be a small patch going up on the PTR where players can actually hop on and test out flying in Draenor. And we have some work to do still, but that mini patch will be hitting the PTR very soon.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we got. You got anything else, Perk?
I am good.
Well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, really fascinating. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. Bye.